I took her up somewhere nice in Kenya and proposed.
It's very romantic. There's a true romantic in that.
There is.
And you said yes, obviously.
Of course, yeah.
Behind palace walls where silence is currency and loyalty is enforced, a quiet breach changes everything. A set of phone records, never meant to be seen, reveals a clear pattern of late-night calls, precise timing, and one name that should never have appeared on the other end of the line. These were not casual conversations or misunderstandings. Each call carried intent, coordination, and consequence. As the records are reviewed internally, trust fractures and long-standing tensions surface. Who was Camilla really speaking to, and why were these calls so carefully hidden? Let's find out. The locked drawer. The audit was meant to be routine, one of those tedious administrative exercises that existed more for appearance than discovery. Margaret Thornberry had conducted dozens of them over her 18 years in the household, moving through offices and storage rooms with the methodical detachment of someone who expected to find nothing more alarming than outdated stationery or forgotten Christmas cards. The communications drawer in the private office was locked, which wasn't unusual. Senior staff maintained locked storage for sensitive correspondence. What gave Margaret pause was that this particular drawer wasn't listed in the current inventory, though it appeared in logs from 3 years prior. A clerical oversight, most likely. She retrieved the master key from the duty officer and turned it smoothly. Inside, nestled between folders of blank letterhead, sat a mobile phone, not a smartphone. Something deliberately older, a model from perhaps 2015. The kind that could make calls and send texts but wouldn't connect to email servers or palace networks. The kind you could use without leaving digital breadcrumbs across synchronized systems. Margaret lifted it carefully. The battery was charged. Someone had been maintaining it. She pressed the power button more from instinct than authorization. The device came to life without requesting a passcode, another deliberate choice. No security meant no locked evidence if it were ever discovered. But it also meant no protection against discovery. The call log was sparse. 12 outgoing calls over the past 14 months, never more than one per month, sometimes 2 months between entries. Each call lasted between 40 and 90 seconds. Short. Purposeful. The timing showed calculation too, always mid-morning on weekdays, never weekends, never during official engagements that would appear on the public calendar. This wasn't a forgotten phone. This was a working tool, used exactly as often as needed and not one call more. Margaret felt her pulse quicken in a way it hadn't during an audit in years. The phone's very existence violated protocol. All palace communications devices were registered, logged, and tracked. Security protocols demanded it. This phone existed outside that system entirely. She knew whose office this was. Everyone in the household knew. That knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. The temptation to simply close the drawer, lock it, and mark the inventory as complete pressed against her professional conscience. But Margaret Thornberry hadn't lasted 18 years by ignoring irregularities, and she hadn't earned her position by pretending not to see what stood directly in front of her. She photographed the call log with her own phone-breaking protocol herself. Now, she realized with grim irony and carefully returned the device to its precise position. The drawer locked with a soft click. Margaret stood in the silent office, staring at the polished wood. The question wasn't whether the phone belonged to the Queen Consort. The location made that obvious. The question was why someone who had access to every official communication channel the Crown could provide secure lines, encrypted devices. Dedicated staff would need a phone that existed in the shadows. And more troubling still, who was on the other end of those 12 careful calls? The name that shouldn't be there. Margaret waited until evening to examine the photograph properly. In her small office in the staff quarters, door closed, she enlarged the image on her screen. The contact list contained only 3 entries. 2 were unlabeled numbers, 1 mobile, 1 landline. The third carried a name, or rather an abbreviation, LH, Household Archive. Household Archive. A deliberately bureaucratic label, the kind that sounded official enough to be boring, but Margaret had worked in palace administration long enough to know that there was no department called Household Archive. There was the Royal Archives, the Household Records Office, the private secretary's historical files. No Household Archive. She opened the internal directory, the master list of every staff member, contractor, and affiliate with official palace connections. She searched variations, archive, historical, records. Nothing matched the abbreviation L.H. Then she tried a different approach. She pulled up the personnel database going back 10 years and searched for those initials among former staff. The name appeared immediately: Laura Henley. Margaret's breath caught. Laura Henley had been part of the household management team 6 years ago, technically under the designation of deputy to the master of the household, though her actual role had been more influential than the title suggested. She had managed private scheduling, coordinated access to personal quarters, and served as a discreet liaison for matters too sensitive for broader staff involvement. Then, quietly and without public announcement, Laura Henley had been transferred to a heritage property in Scotland. Not dismissed, not disgraced, simply relocated. The kind of move that signaled someone had become inconvenient without being openly problematic. The official reason given internally was organizational restructuring. The whispered reason passed between senior staff over careful lunches was that Laura had developed too much influence over certain household decisions, that she had been making judgments above her station, that someone needed to reclaim control. That someone, according to the rumors Margaret had heard but never confirmed, had been preparing for a future role as queen consort and didn't appreciate a deputy manager wielding authority that should flow through her. Margaret cross-referenced the mobile number listed under LH, Household Archive, against archived personnel files. It matched Laura Henley's last registered number, from 6 years ago. She sat back in her chair, mind racing. If the phone logs were accurate, Camilla had called Laura Henley at least 12 times in the past 14 months. Short calls, planned calls. This wasn't accidental contact or nostalgic catching up. This was operational. But Laura Henley officially had no role in palace operations. She worked in Scotland managing a historic estate that received perhaps 3,000 visitors annually. She had no business receiving calls from the Queen Consort's private, unregistered phone. Unless she did. Unless Laura Henley had never truly been removed from the inner circle, only removed from official view. Unless she still served a function, still provided access, still influenced arrangements through channels that bypassed the legitimate chain of command. Margaret thought of the drawer, the outdated phone, the calculated timing of calls. This wasn't about sentiment. This was about control, about maintaining influence through a network that existed beneath the formal structures everyone else followed. The palace had protocols precisely to prevent this kind of shadow operation. Trust was foundational, but so was transparency, so was accountability. Margaret looked at her screen, at Laura Henley's name glowing in the database. The question was no longer what she had discovered. The question was what she was going to do about it. Timing is everything. Margaret spent the next 3 days building a timeline she couldn't unsee. She pulled the call log dates from her photograph and cross-referenced them against palace calendars, not the public ones, but the internal scheduling systems that tracked staff movements, household meetings, and private family events, the kind of information that required her clearance level to access, and that she told herself she was reviewing for legitimate administrative purposes. The first call, 14 months ago, came 2 days before the sudden reassignment of Emma Caldwell. Emma had been a personal assistant to the Duchess of Edinburgh, competent, discreet, well-liked. Her transfer to the estate management office had been announced as a promotion, though anyone paying attention noticed it removed her from direct contact with family members. At the time, it had seemed like routine restructuring. But 2 days before the transfer memo circulated, Camilla had made a 90-second call to Laura Henley. Margaret moved to the second call, 11 months back. 3 days later, the protocol for private family dinners had been quietly revised. Previously, seating arrangements fell under the master of the household's jurisdiction, with input from senior royals. The new protocol shifted final approval to the Queen Consort's private secretary. A small change, barely noticed, but it meant every intimate family gathering now flowed through Camilla's office. The third call, 9 months ago. Within a week, 2 long-serving staff members in the nursery wing, women who had helped care for the Wales children since they were small, were offered generous early retirement packages. They accepted. They were replaced with newer staff, efficiently trained, perfectly professional, but without the deep personal bonds the children had relied upon. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. She continued through the log. Each call preceded something. Not scandals, not drama, just small, strategic adjustments that slowly reconfigured the palace's internal power structure. A call before the Deputy Communications Director, known for his close working relationship with the Prince of Wales, was transferred to regional duties. A call before the revised security protocols that required all private correspondence to be logged through the Queen Consort's office for coordination purposes. A call before a beloved equerry, who had served 3 generations and provided emotional support during the late Queen's final years, announced his retirement for personal reasons. None of these changes carried Camilla's signature. They came through proper channels: the Master of the Household, the Private Secretary, the Lord Chamberlain's office. They appeared bureaucratic, even reasonable when viewed individually. But when mapped against those 12 calls, a pattern emerged with surgical clarity. The calls weren't reactions to events, they were instructions preceding them. Margaret imagined those 90-second conversations. Laura Henley, in Scotland, still maintaining contacts within the household, still understanding the operational mechanics. Camilla, outlining what needed to happen. Laura, identifying the levers to pull, the people to approach, the bureaucratic pathways that would make it appear organic. A shadow chain of command. Margaret printed the timeline on her personal printer, not the office network. She stared at the document on her desk: dates, events, intervals. The evidence of something that wasn't illegal, wasn't even clearly unethical, but was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Because palaces didn't run on official power alone. They ran on trust, on institutional memory, on relationships built over years. And someone had been systematically dismantling those bonds, replacing them with structures that centralized control while maintaining plausible deniability. The calls weren't mistakes, they were architecture, the quiet disappearances. Thomas Pemberton had worked in the palace for 32 years. He had started as a junior footman, risen to senior household coordinator, and spent the last decade serving as a quiet anchor for the younger royals, someone who remembered their childhood preferences, who knew when they needed space versus company, who could diffuse tension with a badly timed tea trolley and a kind word. He announced his retirement on a Tuesday morning. The statement cited his desire to spend time with grandchildren. His colleagues threw him a modest farewell gathering. He smiled, accepted gifts, and said all the appropriate things. Margaret had known Thomas since her first week at the palace. He'd shown her where the good tea was kept and which corridors to avoid during state visits. When she cornered him in the hallway after the gathering, she asked him directly, "Did you want to retire?" Thomas looked at her with tired eyes. "Want doesn't really factor in, does it?" He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Margaret began noticing the others. Sophia Martinez, who had coordinated educational programming for the younger royals and had helped the Princess of Wales navigate the overwhelming first years of royal motherhood, was transferred to the Royal Collection Trust. Important work, certainly, but it removed her from daily contact with the family. James Northwood, an assistant private secretary known for his fierce loyalty to the Prince of Wales and his willingness to push back on decisions he felt were unwise, accepted a position at a charitable foundation. Everyone praised it as a natural progression. No one mentioned that it happened 3 weeks after he'd questioned a scheduling change that minimized the prince's involvement in a key ceremony. The changes were always wrapped in positive language: promotions, opportunities, natural career evolution. But the common thread was unmistakable. People who provided emotional support, institutional memory, or independent judgment were being systematically moved away from positions of influence. They were replaced with staff who were competent but newer, professional but without deep loyalties, efficient but without the informal authority that came from decades of service and personal bonds. Margaret watched the palace change texture. Interactions became more formal. The casual tea gatherings where staff and family members might cross paths grew rarer. Security protocols tightened in ways that made spontaneous contact difficult. Memo circulation became more controlled, with information flowing through specific channels rather than the traditional network of trusted individuals. Nothing was openly cruel. No one was mistreated in any actionable sense. But warmth was being replaced with efficiency. Trust was being replaced with procedure. The palace was becoming a machine that ran smoothly but coldly. Margaret noticed it most acutely during the Wales Children's School holiday. Previously, staff who had known them since birth would check in casually, bring favorite snacks, maintain the small kindnesses that made the palace feel like something more than a historic building. This year, those interactions were fewer. The children were well cared for, certainly, but by a rotating schedule of professional staff rather than familiar faces. One evening, Margaret passed Princess Charlotte in a corridor. The child was 10 now, old enough to notice changes even if she didn't fully understand them. She looked smaller somehow, moving through spaces that felt larger and emptier than they should. Margaret wanted to stop, to say something warm and reassuring. But she caught sight of a private secretary watching from an alcove, and she remembered the new protocols about staff interactions with family members. She smiled politely and kept walking. That night, she pulled out her timeline again. She traced the calls, the transfers, the retirements, the protocol changes. Each call to Laura Henley preceded another quiet disappearance. Another bond severed. Another source of independent support removed. This wasn't about efficiency or modernization. This was about isolation. About ensuring that emotional allegiances, institutional memory, and informal power networks all flowed through one central point of control. Margaret thought about Thomas Pemberton's tired eyes, about Emma Caldwell's promotion, about the nursery staff who had loved those children and were now replaced by strangers. She thought about a 10-year-old princess walking alone through corridors that used to feel like home. And she thought about 12 90-second phone calls that had quietly, systematically made it all happen. The children notice. Prince Louis was 8 years old when he asked the question that made Margaret's heart crack. She had been passing through the family kitchen, one of the smaller, less formal spaces where staff sometimes prepared snacks between official meals. Louis sat at the counter with a plate of biscuits, swinging his legs, waiting for someone. He asked why Mrs. Davies no longer worked there. Mrs. Davies had been one of the nursery staff, the one who knew Louis preferred his sandwiches, cut into triangles, who could coax him through homework with patient humor, who remembered that he got anxious before piano lessons and needed exactly 7 minutes of quiet time beforehand. She had retired 4 months ago, early retirement package, very generous. Margaret told him Mrs. Davies had decided it was time to spend more time at home, hating how practiced the lie sounded. Louis nodded, absorbing this. Then he asked about Mr. Thomas and Miss Emma, and the lady who used to help his mother with speeches. He was not asking with suspicion. He was asking with the genuine confusion of a child who had noticed something was wrong but could not articulate what. Margaret explained that sometimes people moved to different jobs, that it was normal. Louis said they had not said goodbye properly, not really. They had just stopped being there. Margaret had no good answer for that. Louis ate another biscuit, thoughtful in the way children sometimes are when they are processing something larger than they have words for. He said it felt different now. Like everyone was being nice because they were supposed to be, not because they wanted to be. Margaret felt something sharp lodge in her throat. Louis added that kindness felt scheduled. He looked up at her with those serious eyes that seemed too old for 8, and Margaret understood with sudden, painful clarity what these calls had really been about. It was not just about removing people who had independent authority or institutional memory. It was about removing people who loved these children without calculation. People who provided warmth and stability not because it was their job description but because they had known these children since birth and cared about them as human beings, not royal assets. The palace was being restructured into something more controlled, more efficient, more centrally managed. And in that restructuring, spontaneous affection had become a liability. Genuine bonds had become complications. The messiness of real relationship had been replaced with the tidiness of professional service. Charlotte noticed it too, though she expressed it differently. At 13, she had grown quieter over the past year, more careful. She asked fewer questions. She smiled on cue. Margaret had watched her withdraw into a kind of polite caution, as if she had learned that authentic emotion was somehow inappropriate now. Even George, at 15 and more aware of protocol, seemed diminished. He had always been serious, but there had been moments of dry humor, flashes of personality. Those came less frequently now. He moved through his duties with mechanical precision, as if he had absorbed the message that this was an institution first and a family second. Margaret thought of them late at night, 3 children growing up in a palace that was slowly becoming colder, more formal, more isolating. They were well cared for in every measurable way. They had tutors, security, staff, resources, They had everything except the informal network of people who had loved them without agenda. And somewhere in Scotland, Laura Henley answered 90-second phone calls and helped orchestrate it all. Margaret sat in her office that night, staring at her timeline. She had been thinking about this as an administrative irregularity, a protocol violation, a question of proper channels and institutional authority. But Louis's question about why kindness now felt scheduled reframed everything. This was not just about power, it was about atmosphere, about slowly transforming a home into an institution, about replacing warmth with efficiency, about ensuring that even childhood unfolded under managed conditions. And it was working. The confrontation that never happens. The Princess of Wales learned about the phone 3 weeks after Margaret discovered it. Not from Margaret directly, that would have violated every protocol Margaret understood about chain of command. But information moved through palaces the way water found cracks, and someone in the private secretary's office had mentioned something to someone else, and eventually Catherine heard enough fragments to ask careful questions. She requested a private meeting with the master of the household. He confirmed that an irregularity had been discovered during a routine audit, an unregistered communications device. He did not say whose office it had been found in. He did not need to. Catherine asked whether the matter was being investigated. The master of the household said the situation was being carefully reviewed. His tone suggested that careful review was the extent of action anyone intended to take. She raised it with William that evening, in the private sitting room where they could speak without staff present. William listened, his expression darkening. He asked whether they were certain about the facts. Catherine said they were as certain as they could be without directly confronting someone who outranked nearly everyone in the household. William was quiet for a long time. Then he said they should speak with his father. The king received them 2 days later, in his private study. William presented what they knew: the unregistered phone, the contact with Laura Henley, the timing aligned with staff changes and protocol adjustments. He was precise, factual, careful not to make accusations he could not prove. The king listened without interruption. When William finished, there was a long silence. The king said he would look into the matter. His tone was measured, almost gentle. He did not seem surprised. William pressed. He asked whether his father understood the implications that someone was operating a shadow channel of influence, that staff were being systematically removed, that the children were noticing the changes. The king said he understood. He also said that palace management was complex, that efficiency sometimes required difficult decisions, that change was inevitable in any institution. Catherine spoke then, quietly. She said this was not about efficiency, this was about control, about isolating people, removing support systems, making the palace feel less like a home. The king looked at her with something that might have been sympathy or might have been exhaustion. He said he would speak with Camilla about the communications protocols. He suggested that perhaps some of the recent staff changes had been too abrupt, and that future transitions should be handled with more sensitivity. It was not a promise of action. It was an acknowledgement designed to end the conversation. William asked directly whether the phone would be confiscated, whether Laura Henley's contact with the household would be terminated. The king said that these were delicate matters, that accusations without absolute proof could cause more harm than good, that he needed to handle this through appropriate channels, which meant he would handle it by not handling it at all. The meeting ended with polite formality. The king assured them he took their concerns seriously. William and Catherine left understanding that seriously meant nothing would change. 3 days later, Camilla hosted a small luncheon for senior staff. She was warm, gracious, attentive. She asked about people's families, remembered personal details, laughed at the right moments. She mentioned how much she valued the professionalism and dedication of the household team, how grateful she was for their service during a period of transition. She did not mention the phone, no one expected her to. Margaret was not invited to the luncheon, but she heard about it from colleagues who attended. They described Camilla as charming, engaged, entirely at ease. One of them mentioned how impressive it was that she managed so many responsibilities with such grace. That evening, Margaret checked the palace directories one more time. Laura Henley's employment status showed no changes. Her contact information remained active in the archived personnel files. The next week, another long-serving staff member announced their retirement. The memo cited health reasons. Margaret did not bother checking whether there had been a 90-second phone call first. She already knew. The palace continued its work ceremonies and state dinners and official visits. The Prince and Princess of Wales attended their engagements with practiced smiles. The children went to school and came home to a household that functioned perfectly and felt increasingly hollow. And in a locked drawer in a private office, a phone waited for the next time it would be needed. Because that was the genius of it, Margaret realized. There was nothing to confront. No smoking gun. No clear violation that anyone could point to and say this crosses the line. Just a series of reasonable decisions made through proper channels, all of which happened to benefit one person's consolidation of control. Plausible deniability was not just a defense, it was the entire strategy, the person on the other end. Margaret traveled to Scotland under the pretense of coordinating records transfers between properties, legitimate work that fell within her administrative purview. No one questioned it. No one needed to know her real destination. Laura Henley lived in a stone cottage near the estate she managed, a comfortable property with a view of rolling hills that seemed designed for dignified exile. Margaret arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, early enough that refusal would seem churlish. Laura answered the door with the careful composure of someone who had been expecting this conversation eventually, if not today. She invited Margaret in without hesitation, made tea without asking whether it was wanted, and settled into an armchair with the patience of someone who knew how to wait out discomfort. Margaret did not waste time with pleasantries. She asked how long Laura had been advising the Queen Consort through unofficial channels. Laura smiled slightly. She said she preferred the term consulting, and that it had been approximately 6 years since shortly after her transfer to Scotland. She said this without defensiveness, as if discussing garden maintenance rather than shadow governance. Margaret asked what exactly these consultations entailed. Laura explained that she understood palace operations better than most people who had spent decades in service. She knew how power moved through the institution, not the official hierarchy that appeared on organizational charts, but the real power that flowed through relationships, loyalties, informal networks. She knew which staff members held genuine influence, who the younger royals trusted, where emotional attachments created vulnerabilities in the system. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She asked whether Laura meant where emotional attachments created complications for centralized control. Laura did not flinch. She said that palaces could not function on sentiment alone. That structure required difficult decisions. That sometimes people who were very good at their jobs needed to be moved because their personal bonds created divided loyalties or resistance to necessary changes. She spoke about it clinically, as if describing pest control rather than dismantling support systems that children depended on. Margaret asked about specific cases, about Emma Caldwell, who had provided stability to younger royals, about Thomas Pemberton, who had been an emotional anchor for 3 decades, about the nursery staff who had loved the Wales children since infancy. Laura acknowledged each case without apology. She said Emma had been too close to the Duchess of Edinburgh, creating a competing center of influence. Thomas had been protective of the Wales children in ways that sometimes contradicted protocol adjustments. The nursery staff had encouraged informality that was charming but inconsistent with preparing the children for their eventual roles. Her language was careful, almost therapeutic. She spoke about healthy boundaries and appropriate professional distance, and the importance of institutional coherence. She made cruelty sound like leadership development. Margaret understood then why Camilla trusted her. Laura Henley did not command or threaten. She did not need to. She simply identified exactly where to apply pressure to achieve a desired outcome while maintaining complete deniability. She understood palace psychology the way a surgeon understood anatomy, knowing precisely where to cut to disable without killing. Margaret asked whether Laura felt any responsibility for what these changes had cost the children. Laura set down her teacup with deliberate care. She said the children would be fine, that they were receiving excellent care, that learning to function within institutional constraints was part of their education. She said this was how monarchies survived, by prioritizing the institution over individual comfort. Margaret thought of Louis asking why kindness felt scheduled, of Charlotte's growing silence, of George's mechanical precision. She asked whether Laura had children of her own. Laura said she did not, and that perhaps that was why she could see the situation clearly rather than sentimentally. Margaret left the cottage 20 minutes later with a comprehensive understanding she had not wanted. Laura Henley was not a monster. She was something more dangerous, a person of considerable intelligence and skill who had convinced herself that systematic emotional deprivation was professional excellence, who genuinely believed that removing warmth from children's lives was preparing them for duty. And Camilla had found her, recognized her utility, and maintained contact for 6 years through an unregistered phone because Laura Henley could help build exactly the kind of palace Camilla wanted: efficient, controlled, and centered entirely around one point of authority. Margaret drove back to London, understanding that this was not just about improper communications or protocol violations. This was about two people who had formed a partnership to methodically rebuild the palace infrastructure into something colder and more controllable, one 90-second call at a time, and they were very, very good at it. The breaking point. The 13th call came on a Wednesday in late autumn. Margaret knew about it within hours because she had begun monitoring the drawer more carefully, checking it during her legitimate rounds in ways that appeared routine. The call lasted 73 seconds. 3 days later, a memo circulated regarding Princess Charlotte's upcoming 13th birthday arrangements. The memo outlined a schedule that was appropriate, well-organized, and devastatingly cold. Charlotte would attend a formal luncheon with selected family members, selected by the Queen Consort's office, the memo specified. She would participate in a brief photo opportunity. She would receive gifts during a private audience with senior royals. The entire event would last approximately 3 hours, after which Charlotte would return to her studies. What the memo did not include was the informal gathering Charlotte had been quietly hoping for: a small celebration with the staff members who had known her since birth, the kind of relaxed afternoon where she could be 13 rather than a princess. That tradition, established during the late Queen's time, had been deemed inconsistent with current protocol standards. Margaret learned about Charlotte's hopes from a junior secretary who had overheard the princess asking her mother whether Mrs. Davies might visit for the birthday. Catherine had apparently gone very still, then explained gently that Mrs. Davies was enjoying her retirement and that perhaps they could send her a note instead. The junior secretary said Charlotte had nodded with the practiced composure of someone who had learned not to expect warmth, only correctness. Margaret sat in her office that night, staring at the memo, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. This was not about efficiency. This was not about institutional necessity. This was about a 13-year-old girl being systematically denied ordinary human connection on her birthday because allowing it would acknowledge that bonds existed outside the official chain of command. It was not illegal. It was not even clearly reportable. It was simply unnecessary cruelty, dressed as tradition that had been invented 3 months ago through a protocol adjustment that followed a 73-second phone call. Margaret thought about the timeline she had built. About 12, now 13 calls that had preceded staff removals, protocol changes, and the steady erosion of warmth from a palace where children were growing up. She thought about Laura Henley's clinical explanations and Camilla's plausible deniability and the king's refusal to act. She thought about doing nothing, which was what institutional preservation demanded. The palace would continue functioning. The monarchy would maintain its stability. And 3 children would grow up in an environment that taught them to expect professionalism, but not love, duty but not joy. Silence now equaled complicity, but exposure would destabilize the palace at a time when the monarchy could not afford scandal. It would damage the institution she had served for 18 years. It would likely end her career and possibly accomplish nothing except creating headlines that would be managed and contained and ultimately forgotten. Margaret spent 3 days weighing these calculations. Then she stopped calculating and started documenting. She compiled everything: the phone records, the timeline of calls mapped against palace events, the staff members removed and the timing of their departures, the protocol changes that had quietly centralized authority, Charlotte's birthday memo with its careful elimination of human warmth. She did not compile it for the press. Tabloid exposure would turn this into spectacle rather than accountability. She did not compile it for immediate action, because she understood now that immediate action would not come. She compiled it for history. She created a detailed record: dates, evidence, context, and sealed it with instructions that it be preserved in the royal archives under restricted access, not secret, not hidden, simply documented and preserved, so that historians evaluating this period would understand exactly how power had been consolidated and at what cost. She included a cover letter explaining her concerns, her attempts to work through proper channels, and her conclusion that institutional loyalty sometimes required bearing witness even when intervention was impossible. She dated it, signed it, and filed it through the proper archival channels. Then she went back to work. The palace chooses itself. The private secretary to the king requested a meeting with Margaret on a grey morning in December. The summons came through proper channels, professionally worded, offering no indication of its purpose. Margaret knew anyway. Sir Edmund Hargrove had served the crown for 34 years. He had navigated 3 reigns, countless scandals, and the delicate mathematics of institutional survival. He was not unkind, but kindness was never his priority. The institution was. Margaret arrived at his office at the appointed time. On his desk sat her archival submission, apparently rerouted for immediate review. He asked whether she had shared this information with anyone outside the palace. She had not. He asked whether she intended to. She said her intention had been preservation, not exposure. Sir Edmund nodded. He said that was wise. He told her the palace appreciated her diligence and discretion. He said the matters she had raised were being taken seriously at the highest levels. He said appropriate actions would be implemented to ensure proper protocols were maintained going forward. Margaret asked what appropriate actions meant. Sir Edmund said that would be handled internally, as was proper for household management. Margaret asked whether the Queen Consort would face consequences for operating an unauthorized communications channel that had influenced staff removals affecting the Wales children. Sir Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the palace did not benefit from public recriminations or internal conflict, particularly during a period of transition. He said stability required careful management of information and measured responses to irregularities. No punishment, no scandal, no accountability. The device had already been removed and would be disposed of through secure channels, he told her. Laura Henley's contact with household operations would be terminated. Revised protocols regarding communications devices would be implemented across all senior staff. Margaret asked about the staff who had been removed whether they would be offered reinstatement or acknowledgement. Sir Edmund said personnel decisions were complex and involved multiple factors. He said it would not be productive to revisit concluded matters or suggest previous decisions were improper. Margaret asked about the children whether anyone was concerned about the emotional impact, whether Charlotte's birthday arrangements might be reconsidered. Sir Edmund said the Wales children received exceptional care and that their well-being was always paramount. He said preparing them for their future roles required appropriate boundaries and professional relationships. He said this without irony, as if Catherine and William had not tried to intervene and been quietly shut down. Margaret understood completely. The palace was not interested in justice or protecting children from systematic emotional deprivation. The palace was interested in containing a problem before it became a scandal. Sir Edmund stood. He said her record would be sealed with appropriate classification. He said her discretion reflected great credit on her professionalism. The evidence existed, the palace acknowledged it existed, and it would be buried where it could never cause institutional damage. 3 weeks later, all senior staff were reminded of protocols regarding communications devices. The notice did not mention why these reminders were suddenly necessary. It did not name anyone. Laura Henley's employment was modified, removing her from any advisory capacity. The phone was destroyed. Camilla continued her duties without interruption. No investigation was opened, no consequences were imposed. But something had shifted. Protocol adjustments from the Queen Consort's office slowed. Requests now required additional review. Information took different routes. She was not punished. She was contained. Power was not taken from her. It was boxed in. The staff who had been removed remained gone. The bonds that had been severed remained severed. The children continued growing up in an environment that valued efficiency over warmth. But there would be no more secret phones. Not because it was wrong, because it had been documented. The palace had chosen itself, as it always did.